going to move on to our penultimate play, the fourth of the tragedies that we'll study together, and by many accounts, the greatest. I'm not so sure that is so, but it is viewed by many as the greatest play that Shakespeare wrote. It is a tragedy. It's called the Tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. And yet it is also, in some ways, like Measure for Measure, a problem play. Because Hamlet himself is an enigma as a character. He seems incapable of doing what needs to be done, what should be done. And what he should do is revenge the death of his father. And in terms of historical precedents for these things, it goes back as far as the Odyssey, when we see Orestes revenging his father's untimely death, his murder, at the hands of his mother's adulterous lover. And that is praised in the Odyssey by the gods as an action that needs to happen, should happen, and nonetheless, in the case of the Odyssey, that will also bring wrath upon his house because he's murdered his mother in the process, which is also not a good thing. But still, the gods urge it on and approve of what has happened there. So taking revenge on your stepfather, you're the man who has an adulterous affair with your mother, has strong precedent, and it's part of the revenge tragedy which is common in Shakespeare's day. And there is a work by Thomas Kyd called The Spanish Tragedy in 1592, which is modeled after this type of revenge tragedy. And Hamlet probably ought to be seen in the light of that work and those types of revenge tragedies. Now, in the original, that is the Spanish tragedy by Thomas Kyd, Hieronymo the son is killed, and he seeks revenge. And there's a play within the play. There's a ghost that appears. The figure feigns madness, and in some ways, it's similar to Hamlet. In some ways, it reverses what happens in Hamlet, because in the other play, it's the son that's killed, not the father. But it's there in the background. But more specifically, the source for this story, perhaps in Saxo Grammaticus from 1200, sort of a pseudo-historical story. There was a king of Denmark murdered by a brother, who then went on to marry his brother's wife. And the figure, whose name is Hamlet, with a B, Hamlet, seeks revenge, feigns madness, is tested by the new king, and gives himself away in the process. He does rebuke his mother, becomes reconciled with her, and he returns from England and gets his revenge on his father. So it's very much obvious leanings in terms of the storyline, plot line for Shakespeare. Now, we've seen this in Shakespeare already, that sometimes he gets them directly from historical sources and just presents them. Sometimes he tweaks them a little bit. Sometimes he seems to create the stories himself almost without historical precedent. And in all of that, it makes us, and I haven't said much about this, it makes us question the portrait of Shakespeare as an original genius, as the foremost representative of the imagination, which is how the Romantics received him, and to some degree how the Academy has sort of baked in Shakespeare within the pantheon of the great writers in the English language. He is the poet of the imagination. And when we think of the imagination, we tend to think of it in terms of the way the Romantics see the imagination, which is in terms of originality. To this day, and since the Romantics, we associate originality with excellent artistry. Particularly as the sort of role model or the ideal for creative genius is to be original, to do nothing like anybody has done before you. You're not imitating, you are producing something from within yourself, an excellence that has never been seen on the face of the earth. And the Romantics cultivate that idea of being original geniuses and creating stories ex nihilo, as it were. Shakespeare does not follow that ideal because he normally gets his sources from previous writers and simply copies their storylines, even sometimes their stories. And the standard of artistry then is not originality, it's excellence in dramatizing the matters of life. And I say that because in creative writing classes, creative writing, a discipline in universities that has only existed since the late 19th century. The aim is to express your thoughts and your feelings. And you start with the blank page and then you think, what do I want to say? And you pause in front of the page and you don't know where to begin, and you feel like you have to generate the story yourself out of nothing. And some novelists will even talk about how the stories write themselves. A character, they start with a character and then the character does this and then the next thing happens and so on. Charles Dickens wrote in a serial fashion. He produced his stories on chapters on a weekly basis for magazines, and he didn't know what was going to happen. And because it was serialized and he wanted people to come back and read next week, he ended every episode on a cliffhanger. You'll notice this when you read the chapters, it finishes with a little bit of suspense, so I got to come back and get the next installation. But he himself, to some degree, is watching the story unfold. He hasn't mapped out what's going to happen. He's not following a template. Even within his own mind, the characters are to some degree writing it. Now, I think he must have some idea in his mind sort of the general plot line of the story, but the characters to some degree dictate what will happen. That's the model for artistry that we think we ought to follow ourselves when we do creative writing. That sense of originality, it originates in you. That is not Shakespeare's model. He doesn't want it to be his model. He wouldn't see it as his ideal, and it is not the ideal. Because Shakespeare writes in the light of both the classical and the biblical age, in which goodness, greatness, beauty, truth have already been described for us. The storyline of humanity is there in scripture and in art, and good artists imitate other artists. They simply do. They're happy to do it. They do not feel that they are diminishing their excellence as artists who follow the genre, the plot line, the characters, the stories of any previous writers. They're not concerned by that whatsoever. And we should not be either. And so I say this as an encouragement. People who are creative, there are some people who are more inclined to be creative than others, and yet they feel the paralysis of the blank page and don't know where to begin. One place you could begin is simply with a story that somebody else has written and retell it in a certain way. It's the telling of the tale that shows the excellence of the artist, not the invention of the tale. You don't have to invent things. God alone creates ex nihilo. We do not have to. And the stories that have been told, the best stories are the old stories that are recapitulated and represented, and a good artist is the one that tells an old story in a fresh and compelling way. And Shakespeare does that. Maybe all of his works have a source for them. Sometimes it's not clear, but in this case it is. His greatest play, Hamlet, is clearly leaning on sources that are known to us and known to him. And we do not judge him for having followed them. What we then judge good art by is their capacity for virtuosity, for excellence. Just like when you play a piece or sing a song, the notes are there, other people have sung it, the tune's familiar, it's the voice and the interpretation that you're judging. The performance, and every performance is different, and we're talking about drama here. Hamlet is going to be presented on stage, and each time you walk on the stage, you're following the lines, the stage directions and so forth, but there's something that's new about it, and that's the moment you're in. Sometimes you're on your game, sometimes you're a little off your game. Anyway, but it's that idea of artistry, I think we need to have that in mind when Shakespeare tells his plays. And the second thing I need to say is that when Shakespeare is creating his dramas, he has in mind the high responsibility of the artist to be teaching his audience how to live. That's the purpose of all of Shakespeare's art. He's a Renaissance dramatist, and he takes very seriously, and if he didn't, his audience certainly would, of the responsibility of the artist to instruct his audience in proper living. He needs to show things as they are, true to life, but he also needs to direct us in how to act, to be better or to show us the implications of acting badly. And that's what tragedies do. They show people who do evil actions get punished for their evil actions. So there's always a tight moral theme throughout the whole thing, or sometimes it's very strong. So the moral element Shakespeare's not going to shy away from. After the Romantics, particularly come the late 19th century, you will get dramatists and artists that will talk about art for art's sake. So beauty for the sake of beauty, no concern for goodness, for ethics, and so forth. It's not my responsibility as an artist to teach you anything. Shakespeare would not agree. His audience would not agree. He wants to acquaint you with reality, a reality that I've already said is hierarchical in nature. It reflects God's own artistry. When Shakespeare writes, he's reflecting God's own artistic design, which always has a moral purpose. He's reflecting that in his own actions. And he puts characters in his plays that I've called dramaturge figures, and they're surrogates for the playwright. So they're like Shakespeare putting Shakespeare in the play and showing how that Shakespearean character tries to orchestrate the plot to a good or an evil end, because sometimes we have anti-dramaturge figures trying to make bad things happen. I'm not looking at it, but Othello has one such figure in Iago. Last time in King Lear, we had the evil character of Edmund. These are anti-dramaturge figures. They're trying to orchestrate the plot in an evil direction, and in the case of Edmund, he's successful in doing so, and he gets killed for it. Again, so there's a playwright within the play, but it's happening on stage, and we can watch what happens when a bad teacher, when a bad dramatist does bad things. Bad results for everybody else, but in the end, he gets his just desserts. There's a very tight sense of, today we'd call it karma, unfortunately. Shakespeare would throw it under the guise of providence and moral order. There's a moral order that is in the fabric of all of nature, which will not tolerate injustice or sin to prevail for too long. Eventually, there will be a comeuppance. Now, usually it's not of the sort where, don't think of it the way we again talk about it in very, I think, alarming terms. We talk about there being a balance that's out, and the suggestion there is things have gone in one direction, and then there'll be a counterbalance as if things will just naturally balance themselves. We don't see that in Shakespeare's plays. Nature does not rebalance itself. People do. actors do. Other agents will come in. So in King Lear, it's France and Cordelia that will come in to rectify the injustice done in the kingdom. Likewise, in Macbeth, we saw that there was a war that broke out to stop the evil and the iniquity from happening. That happens persistently in Shakespeare's plays. It's necessary for people to intervene to stop injustice from perpetuating itself and becoming even worse. Necessary so. So although there is an order of nature that he violates, and there are signs of that spilling over, so as we said in Macbeth, horses eating other horses and lesser predatory birds eating greater predatory birds, just like Macbeth himself, nature doesn't reset itself. It requires human agents to do that. And if they don't do that, there is no justice. Shakespeare's tragedy does not show the proof that God rules justly over all creation. He expects human agents to act. In the face of evil, human agents must respond. And he shows that they do respond, and by doing that, they reinforce the theme that God will not allow sin and evil to persist without consequences. There will ultimately be a judgment. So it's strongly reinforced in his plays, and always tightly, that it's either, as I say, a quasi or potentially tragic situation either goes fully tragic and then dead people on the stage, justice restored. Hamlet will be one such play. Or in the comedy, potential tragedy averted and a marriage scene at the end. In both cases, reinforcing the idea of order, harmony, and justice in human affairs. Both of them reinforce it in a very opposite way, but they have the same message. That's the message that Shakespeare believes, that God rules over human history, and although there are seasons of tragedy, in the end, the malefactors will be judged and punished. And likewise, there's a very life-affirming aspect to comedies that suggests that for all of the potential evil, there's yet goodness in the world and much to be celebrated. And in both cases, pointing to the view that we see in the book of Revelation, where there's a lot of blood, and there's also a marriage. So it's a very realistic portraiture of human life, which Shakespeare's simply accepting as the view of reality, and it structures his plays. We don't see this in the ancient world. The tragedies of, let's say, Oedipus do not reinforce the idea of ultimate judgment. And the comedies do not speak, they don't end in marriages every time, but Shakespeare's do. That's a theological recalibration of both the comedy and the tragedy in accordance with Christian doctrine. And so he's very much using not just the canvas, but the outline of life, and he's just painting in some of the details. So I don't mean to understate Shakespeare's genius. I simply want to explain the nature of it and encourage you that you too can paint within the lines. Really, it's not a bad thing. But this play Hamlet is a little different, and let me say something about that, precisely because the main character seems incapable of action. So he's an odd figure, and when I said that many think it's his greatest play, it's because they to some degree see themselves in Hamlet. It's the type of people like myself that review plays and take interest in plays, the academics and the theatrical types, who like Hamlet because he's a character who lives in his own mind. He's a man of contemplation. When he begins the play, he's come from university. He's had to come back from university because of the tragedy in his family. He's been brought back there, and he's a contemplative figure. And to some degree, it reinforces something we're going to see in the next play as well. And we already saw in Measure for Measure, named Duke Vincentio, I think, is a similar sort of figure. He's a contemplative. He's not a man of action. Prospero will be a similar sort of figure. He's in charge of the little city that he lives in, and he's supposed to rule over it, but he doesn't like action. It bores him. He's more interested in ideas. He wants to think things through. He'd rather sit and read all day and contemplate and talk. He has the mind of the philosopher as opposed to the man of action. So let me just say, have I said anything about this thus far? The vita contemplativa, the vita activa, any of that? Have I said this in the class? I have. Okay. So those idea of two types, he is plucked directly from Aristotle, who is simply describing the standard Athenian view, the standard Greek view of two ways of living a genuine human life, that he has been there since the time of Aristotle, but actually since the time of Socrates, because Socrates challenges the establishment view of what a good and valid human life is, which up to that point had only been in action. The man of action, the politician, the man who stands up in an assembly, speaks in front of his peers. Remember, his peers are men of property who are free from having to labor, who spend their days giving wise counsel in how to relate to the world around them. Should we, fortify the city? Should we plant crops? Should we make alliances with other cities? What's going on here? That sort of political deliberation, and then in concert they decide on a course of action. That's the human life that the classical Greek and the Romans think is a genuinely human life. Socrates introduces a new wrinkle on that. In fact, one that challenges the life of action, which is the life of contemplation, the life of the philosopher. He says is more real, more important than that of the man of action, because it is an eternal life. When we look at the true, the good, the beautiful, the just, and discuss such things, we're discussing ultimate reality which does not change. Men come, men go. That does not come or go. It stays the same. So it's superior, says Socrates, and he lives out that way. Plato promotes it, Aristotle accepts it, says there are two ways to live. But if you're a philosopher, and Plato goes so far as to suggest that the ideal republic would be led by philosophers, right? Philosopher kings, guardians of some sort. Most people do not agree with Plato on this. In fact, I'm not even sure Plato agrees with Plato. In his last work, The Laws, it's far more practical in its advice. It's not pushing the philosopher to be in the position of ruler of a city. Somebody has to be practically interested. But that's not what we saw in Measure for Measure. Vincentio let the laws basically go slack. He didn't enforce them. And the result of that is that his country's gone to seed. There are brothels propping up. There's all sorts of diseases. Chaos is reigning. And he realizes that after 14 years, it's got really bad and something must be done. But because I haven't done anything thus far, I'm going to bring somebody else in to do it. So, or you could see it as he's getting criticized by the moral individuals like Lucio. Says, we need a little bit of law and order around here. People are bad and we need a firm hand. And he looks at him as a young man and says, you know what? You need to learn a lesson. Because you're a very judgmental man and you need to experience what it's like to be in the position of having to decide on matters of life and death. I'll put you in charge. Here we go. And then he sits in the background and watches him, knowing that young people tend to be very judgmental and quick and think that they can solve all problems because the people above them are somehow dim-witted, slow, corrupt, all of which can be true, by the way. And they know what the solution is and they're just going to do it. And he comes in and he does exactly that. And what he doesn't know about himself is that actually he's subject to the same sort of sinful proclivities as all of those who've committed sins around them. In fact, we know he has committed them, and he's just willing to look away. And so what Vincentio does is he starts from the background pulling strings. He's the dramaturge figure that's teaching everybody in the play. He's not just teaching the audience, he's teaching the characters lessons. And Shakespeare says that is the responsibility of every artist. You have to, and every human being, you're there to teach those around you what's right, what's wrong, and how to live. In the end, he shows grace. It's a terrific play. Here, we're going to find there's another play within a play. Hamlet himself will commission it. And he'll comment on the playmaking, the dramaturgy, how to do good art and how not to do it, and so forth, which is very interesting. When he does this, this is Shakespeare inserting a Shakespeare character into his plays. And he's discussing how to be a good thought leader, because that's what he is. That's what a playwright is. In the realm of philosophy, they deal with ideas. In theater, they deal with ideas played out in front of you in terms of action. So we have the politicians who are the men of action, and then we have the dramatists who are men of thought who nonetheless present a world of action in front of us. And they can idealize it, unlike the realm of politics where you don't always see tight moral endings. The playwright can give us tight moral endings, and Shakespeare does. But Hamlet is incapable of the moral action required of him. He's a contemplative. So, as I say, most, or at least many critics regard Hamlet as the greatest tragedy and the greatest play, because they see in Hamlet a man like themselves, a man capable of moral action. Well, that might be because after the Romantics, we distrust moral action entirely. That might be the reason they see Hamlet as so great, because his incapacity to act in a moral way reflects their belief that moral actions are not things that we ought to be involved in. We ought to suspend our own moral judgments. We just live and let live. We don't want to involve ourselves too much, and that might be the main reason. And the crisis point of the play, when Hamlet finally acts, is when he kills his beloved Ophelia's father just rashly. He doesn't even realize who it is. He actually thinks it's his Claudius. He's behind a curtain. And that precipitates all sorts of other things. So he can't even do it the right way. It's a very curious play. I mentioned the one source in Saxo Grammatico. There is in 1576, so this is not long before Shakespeare pens his play, a work called Belle Forest. Belle is in the French, B-E-L-L-E, in which these same characters appear, but there is no ghost. The ghost is not there. Shakespeare puts the ghost back in from Saxo Grammaticus. He sees it as important. And I'm going to talk about that, the inclusion of the ghost and his use of supernatural characters as part of the machinery of the plot, because we see again something of parallels between this and, let's say, Macbeth, where we had the witches, the three witches, and then Hecate comes in and so forth. And even the first play we looked at, A Midsummer Night's Dream, we had supernatural agents directing things, supernatural machinery, as it were. And what do we make of that? What are we to make of that? It certainly disturbs Hamlet. He finds it very difficult. It's right at the outset of the play. And I think if we read it the right way, that is Hamlet, the right way, given the context we have within the play, we can have some understanding of why he doesn't act. But let me get into this. But as I say, the reason that people believe Hamlet is so important is because it's a study in character. It's a type of character or psychology or personality. And after the Romantics, everyone, almost, present company excluded, but almost the whole establishment thinks that the most profound area of interest for human beings is the psyche. The motivation, what lies within you, is the most important thing. I don't think Shakespeare thinks that at all. He has very much of an Elizabethan worldview. The psychology of the character, what motivates the character, is only one part in the whole picture. It's an important part, but it's not the exclusively important part. But for critics after Hamlet, we think that psychology is the primary human interest, the most important thing. And Hamlet, the play Hamlet, almost seems like a study in psychology. And some will say that the reason why he can't act is he's inherently abnormal. He is subversive, he's skeptical towards authority. Some will say some critics have said it's because of the influence of skepticism in European thought around this time. And Shakespeare's reflecting that, and Hamlet's an angry young man. He was inclined towards that to begin with, and then of course his father dies and he's given reason for confirming what he already thought. But this is what prevents him from acting. He was inherently abnormal. Coleridge, the great romantic critic who wrote on Shakespeare, said that Hamlet is a hero because he's inherently different. He had an inner life that was so vivid that he could not act. He couldn't distinguish between reality and his imagination. So he's a figure of the imagination. This is why he's the great hero of the Romantics then, because he has an imaginative life that's so vivid that he actually is incapable of acting outside of his own head. And that would fit the profile of Percy Shelley and Wordsworth, who speak of that sort of experience, and even Blake. They are men whose imagination is so vivid that it overpowers their ability to be active, and probably reflects Coleridge to some degree as well. So he becomes a hero to the Romantics, but he's still abnormal. He's an unusual figure. And in a state akin to madness, he becomes, as the German Romantic critic Schlegel says, he becomes thought sick, denkenskrank. Others will say that the reason why he's incapable of action is it is psychological, but it's because of Freudian psychology. So there's a critic by the name of Ernest Jones who writes an article called Hamlet and Oedipus, who says that who sees Hamlet basically as a patient and diagnoses that the reason why he can't act is because he has a repressed Oedipal drive, and that he actually wanted to mount his mother. Yeah, it was an Oedipus complex because, as you know, Oedipus marries his mother, etc. Hamlet wanted to do this. He repressed it. And as a result, he's incapable of action. So he's just sort of psychologically traumatized and so forth. And I've seen productions where Hamlet's on top of his mother, sort of, imitating. Yeah. And this is the motivation for his inaction. What's the motivation for the inaction? In a critic called G. Wilson Knight, in The Wheel of Fire, he sees Hamlet is infected by a death force. He feels responsible for everything. He's a very responsible young man, and he takes responsibility for everything, including the death of his father. The reason why he's incapable of acting, according to Jones, the Freudian critic, is because he really wanted to kill his mother because he wanted to sleep with his mother. So dad's got to go. He wanted to do that, and somebody else did it, and he feels guilty. So guilt keeps him from acting because he said, he just did what I wanted to do, my uncle. Again, there's no basis in the text for this whatsoever. It's reading into it. But it's reading into the mind and motivations, and this is why later critics, when we come to lit theory, some of you are doing contemporary lit theory with me, will have questions about this style of criticism where the aim of the critic is to get inside the heads of the characters and explain why they act the way they act. The intentions. The famous A.C. Bradley, early 20th century critic, disagreed and said we can be sympathetic with Hamlet, but Hamlet's actually a normal person. He's not suffering from abnormal psychology. He's just a normal person under the influence of extremely abnormal events. He's not inherently flawed. He's not overly imaginative. So pushing back against Shakespeare or Coleridge. He is a Renaissance man for whom tragedy has stricken his family and his kingdom in a particularly vivid way. And because of that, because he's a Renaissance man and is a moral idealist, he doesn't act until he's sure of the right path to take. He's not just going to strike out on the basis of how things appear to be. He wants to investigate, get to the bottom, make certain that it's true. Bradley's take seems to me a little bit closer to accurate. This is a man who's very keen, very perceptive, sees reasons why people do it. He's used to, he's a good reader of texts. He's a good reader of human actions. He's not, and so he's hesitant to immediately jump to conclusions. And he's in a terrible situation there, and he has strong feelings about what's happened. He loved his father. He can't not believe his mother's married his uncle so quickly. You can imagine what will a young man do in this situation? He's filled with all sorts of conflict, but he's not going to jump on that because it's against type. He becomes melancholic, influenced by a character type from his what we called the humors. He's a melancholic, reflective type, and that's part of skepticism as well. And it does take on a form of self-loathing and an inability to act. So Bradley calls it a tragedy of moral idealism. Then a man who's an idealist, who's thrown into a terrible situation and simply can't act. As I say, I think that's a reasonable take. I think we can do a little bit better than that, but that's going in the right direction there in terms of how I see Hamlet and read him. This famous painting here of Hamlet, though, with the skull, I think this is by Delacroix, the French painter, in the 19th century. Portrays him as a sort of an artistic type, which he probably is. Again, he's fascinated by the theater we read. Any comments or questions, though, at the outset? I wanted to introduce that and say some broader things about, again, Shakespeare's general theatrical world, but the play in particular. Yes, go ahead.
Was the archetype of the Renaissance man the contemplative man?
No. Thank you. The Renaissance man. The Renaissance man marries the two men together. The Renaissance man is a man of thought and a man of action. Very good question. I should have said that before as well. The Renaissance man, the ideal of the age, is to do both. Not just busy yourself in being a man of action like the nobility had throughout the medieval period. The nobles busied themselves about the world of affairs, and they left the world of contemplation to the priests. We'll let them, in their cloisters, in their monasteries, contemplate theological niceties and the importance of philosophical and terminological distinctions, but we'll just leave them there with that. We won't apply it to the world. The Renaissance sees that these two worlds need to come together, and the Reformation makes sure that they do come together. Because again, when the Bible is translated into the vernacular, in this case, English, everybody now is reading Scripture, not just the monks. The nobles are reading it for the first time even, in some cases, who haven't learned Latin, but now they are in the schools, which are starting to flourish in the Renaissance. And the Reformation just accelerates that. And the realm of action is now going to be guided by contemplation. So there's a great deal of interest among monarchs in being schooled in philosophy and theology. So Queen Elizabeth was able to read Greek and Latin and wrote on them in those languages as well. Henry VIII was a Renaissance man, a man of action, a man of thought. All of the princes of the day were. That was their ideal, and we have departed from that ideal to some degree. Entirely. Our world now moves in accordance with pragmatism. What's most effective? That's the question. That's an anti-intellectual approach to the bottom. If that's where the rubber hits the road, then you have no map at all. You have a road and you have rubber. You have an engine, you're in the car, but you don't actually know where you're going. You have a very short view of where you're going to go. You'll have a 1-year plan or a 5-year plan, but maybe the road comes to an end at the end of 10 years and you don't even realize that you need to be road building or something like that. You don't have a template for what life is going to look like. You don't have what Shakespeare provides for us, a sense that life is just. But that's the ideal. The Renaissance man will marry those two things together. And they have certain examples of historically how the best leaders actually had that education, one of them being none other than Alexander the Great, who was taught by Aristotle and then was the man of action. Likewise, Cicero and Julius Caesar. So men in the Greek and Roman Republic were men who studied philosophy and politics in an academic fashion. That's how they were taught, and then they were expected to represent that in the way they conducted human affairs. I think it's the ideal, and it's an ideal that should be returned to. But then you would have to think that there has to be truth in texts and in precedent for your own models and edification. You'd have to take the scriptures as not just teaching you about things that happened in the past, but as an authoritative guide to life and conduct in your own life. And we've parted from that because we think we have to be original. No one's ever existed like me before. I'm unique. True. But you're also like every other person who's ever walked the earth. And there's nothing new under the sun, so why would you not learn from other people who are the wisest and the best? And read their stories and teach their stories and replicate their stories. And when you write stories, don't write totally new things. Anyway, and we can see that Tolkien and Lewis, for example, have done precisely that in their fiction as further models for us. So let me go to Hamlet. Let me stop there since that's the introduction. And